Welcome to the Einstein Forum. For those of you who haven't been with us before for this particular conference, I want to say a couple of words about what you've gotten yourselves in for. The Einstein Forum June conference, known in-house as the Board Conference, that is B-O-A-R-D. Up to now, I never met anyone who was actually bored by it. Is the high point of our year because it takes place in conjunction with the annual meeting of our splendid board of advisors, and that for two reasons. One is that since we're not in a position to offer them any money, we want to provide our board members with first-rate intellectual entertainment in exchange for coming. And the second is that we like to put some of them to work since they're all first-rate intellectual entertainers themselves. We decide the topic for each year's June conference. At the previous June conference, somebody comes up with a nugget of an idea that's then discussed at the board meeting, worked through by myself and my colleagues, and presented to you a year later. In this case, it was the Einstein Forum staff member, Dominique Bonfiglio, who provided the nugget with some thoughts about tensions between tribalism and cosmopolitanism, and he will expand on them in the first session tomorrow. Now, we take a certain pride in being avant-garde, and I'd be happy to tick off a list of topics the Einstein Forum brought up just before they became hot topics, people we invited just before they became Nobel laureates, and so on. In this particular case, I'm starting to think we should turn our attention next year to something like butterflies. Our idea was to focus a conference on why right-wing nationalists are so successful at creating solidarity, something that by most lights should actually be self-contradictory, since nationalism tends to the firm belief that my tribe is better than all other tribes. By contrast, those of us who are universalists or cosmopolitans, terms that will be at issue during the discussion for the next couple of days, seem unable to create the same kind of passionate solidarity we see on the right in so many countries around the world. We discussed all this at last year's board meeting and decided it would be an important and appropriate subject for a conference. That was last June before the Brexit, not to mention the disaster that befell the world on November 8th, 2016. Unfortunately, though it was an American disaster, its repercussions for the rest of us are significant enough so that most of the world is glued to the reality show now emanating from Washington. Of course, I'm not so crazy as to think our choosing to run a conference on what turned out to be the subject of the year had anything to do with the events that followed, but I'd be happy to renounce our claims to prescience or avant-gardism in the future and stick to something like butterflies. Not really. Anyway, not to worry. In the last couple of months, I have had Trump-free dinners, lunches, and a Trump-free Seder, except for the part about pouring out wrath on those who know thee not. We are not devoting a conference to the world's most pathological narcissist, pleased as it would make him, though I fear we won't be able to avoid him entirely. There'll be plenty of other problems to cover with 13 speakers from 9 countries, nor will we only be talking about difficulties in creating solidarity. 4 of our speakers were specifically chosen because they're people who've made positive contributions to creating solidarity in very different spaces. I want now to call your attention just to one of them, Alexander Koch, who will be speaking last, so that you have plenty of time to look at the exhibit he created for this conference. Koch is a curator, gallerist, and writer who's the co-founder and director of the German chapter of the New Patrons, which is an international network that provides ordinary citizens with the means to commission art projects in response to social issues, rather than waiting for rich patrons, public or private, to determine what kinds of art is created in their communities. So in the breaks between the conference, you'll want to look at the selection of artworks the New Patrons have created in France and Germany before hearing Alexander talk about the process by which the respective communities created those works of art. The conference language is English, with one exception. Pietro Bartolo, the doctor who has been working with refugees in Lampedusa, will speak in Italian, will provide simultaneous translation into English. You're free to contribute to discussion in German or English. Actually, given the number of languages spoken by participants in this conference, you could even ask questions in Telugu or Navajo. We have enough multilingual guests who can translate, if you like. I want to close with a question that will animate me for sure in this conference. I'm not actually giving a talk myself since I'm on sabbatical this year, though the book that I'm working on is closely connected with the subject. About 2 months ago, I developed an obsession with Paul Robeson. Now, there is a Paul Robeson Straße in Prenzlauer Berg, a relic of DDR-Zeiten, as Robeson was a hero of the international left. Many of you who are under, let's say, about 60 may not have heard of him since McCarthyism did its best to wipe out his reputation, at least in the US. That's about to change, since Steve McQueen and Harry Belafonte are currently working on a biopic. I think that's one of the best pieces of news I've heard this year. I hope that movie may change our conversations about solidarity. For Robeson, an almost unimaginably talented man, the son of a runaway slave who did phenomenal work as a singer, actor, and activist, embodied solidarity in a way that few people ever did. He recorded songs of freedom and resistance in the 6 languages he mastered perfectly, as well as a number of others. And he sang them in benefit concerts for everyone from Jewish refugees from the Nazis to striking Welsh miners to patients who had been wounded in the Spanish Civil War. He fought for African Americans, but also for the rights of all oppressed peoples, and his engagement came at a real cost. During the Cold War, his performances were banned in the US. His passport was revoked by the State Department, his income plummeted, and most people were afraid to be seen with him. A notable exception was Albert Einstein, and one of my favorite Einstein stories concerns the time Robeson, accompanied by a friend, came to Einstein's house in Princeton for a visit. The friend rather awkwardly greeted Einstein with the words, "Oh, Professor Einstein, it's such an honor to meet a great man," whereupon Einstein replied, "What do you mean? You just walked in with a great man." Now, being over 60 myself now, these are all things I've known about Robeson for a while. What fired my recent obsession was a sudden realization that Robeson not only did all of that, but in the 40s and 50s was known for an album that was played so often in my childhood home that I still know most of the words by heart. Kostik is nodding, but your father was a communist. So.
He knew Robeson.
Okay. You have to tell me that story. I don't think as a child I even knew that the singer was a black man. Its most famous piece, Ballad for Americans, is a hymn to an idealized America, which is so hard to believe in today that I suspect my own children would find the lyrics unbelievably kitschy, though I have yet to try it on them. Written in 1939, the 10-minute-long cantata was played, hold your breath, at the 1940 Republican, Democratic, and Communist Party conventions in the United States of America. And in it, a tall, dark son of a slave recites most of the ethnic and religious groups that make up the United States and claims to represent all of them. And the chorus, the dramatic chorus with a sort of dramatic crescendo, which we wouldn't put up with these days, dramatically agrees, this man is America, all of it, and America is an ideal in which belief is eminently possible. Since listening to that cantata several times in the last couple of months, I've been plagued by the question, what happened to us, anyway, us in America, so that a kind of solidarity that was once acclaimed, at least theoretically, at least in song, by all political parties seems unbelievable. I'm not asking that question as a moan, in a spirit of nostalgia, everything was better in the old days. There may be good reasons as well as bad ones for us to find those expressions of solidarity impossible. But in order to find out what expressions of solidarity are possible today, it's important to remember what was possible. I can only hope some of you who don't know it look up the cantata on YouTube and share my own sense of wonder and puzzlement. So that's enough of a general introduction. We have a tradition at the Einstein Forum of eschewing long and flowery introductions of our speakers and printing short bios for you to read in your programs. You can pick up one downstairs or outside, so as not to waste the time you'd rather spend listening to the speaker telling you about him or her. It would be nice, therefore, just to introduce Carey Harrison as professor of English at City University of New York, but even amplifying this by pointing out that he's the author of a terrifying number of novels, plays, and screenplays wouldn't do him justice. Mentioning that he's the Bishop of Woodstock for the Moorish Orthodox Church of America gives a hint of his range. You'll have to ask him about that if you choose. But in addition to the information you have in your programs, I will only add that his latest novel, How to Push Through, which I'm currently finding very hard to put down long enough to think about solidarity, is absolutely stupendous. Carey, thank you for agreeing to open the conference for us.
Good evening, thank you so much for coming. My name is Carey Harrison, as Susan said. I'm a novelist, British born, as you can hear. Wonderful to be here with you, and I want to thank Susan for the privilege of being the first to address you and our topic. I'm, at this moment, still so consumed with the wonderful thought of Robeson, great idol of mine, being the subject of a biopic featuring Harry Belafonte, another idol of mine, a wonderful man, and a man who, as an artist and an activist, seems a perfect choice.
Not clear, actually, that Belafonte is going to be in the pic, but he and Steve McQueen are producing it.
Well, that's a help already. Belafonte came to my college to do the commencement. Still, after 37 years in America, I'm baffled by the word commencement, since it's actually the termination. I suppose it's the commencement of the future life of the students, and that's a nice way to think of it. And he was the speaker, and this is a joke that I fear may be lost on all too many of you, but when his turn came at the microphone as the honored guest, the invited guest, and we all waited for what he had to say, I heard, to my astonishment, because I was watching it from the window of my office, he went, "Day-o, day-o," for which the Banana Boat Song, for which he had been famous as quite a young man, and those of us who recalled that thought this was the most wonderful opening, that instead of the pretensions to international significance that he had, he would offer himself as the singer of the Banana Boat Song, and I God bless him, it's typical of him. So looking at this wonderful image, found, as so many wonderful images that always seem to me to be found by the Einstein Forum for their programs, I'm moved almost to tears by that image. But I'm addressing you as a novelist with, I hope, the permitted perversity that is a novelist's. And I shall not be addressing the wonderful emotions that this picture summons up. However, on the credit side, exhilarating results in the British general election have put me in a whole new mood with regard to imagining solidarity, which I was tempted to say, please do imagine it. If you ever come across it, send me a postcard. But I'm feeling rather more positive now, and my exhilaration is not confined to the largely unanticipated successes of the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and the resurgence of socialism on the British political scene, but to the fact that the mockery to which Corbyn has been subjected for so long, treating him not only as the purveyor of an antique and irrelevant political philosophy, but as in and of himself lacking in the charisma required of a political leader, these have been tipped into the dustbin. To rest for a moment on that one issue, the seeming all-importance of performance in the digital age. It's as though the people of the world are in accord that we must behold a Mussolini in charge, a Trump, I was trying not to use that name, Susan, I promise, a Duterte regardless of creed. It's true that many Labour supporters, myself included, took a certain glee in observing the woodenness of Prime Minister May on the stump, and by contrast, the low-key but now undeniable magnetism of a Labour leader who exuded honesty and decades of unswerving commitment. He spoke simply and modestly with unaffected anger. It was a victory for policy over personality, and that in itself is thrilling, as much today as at any time in history. Well, the British left, if until last week it could even be called a left rather than some species of left-centrism, has long been divided between the party in Parliament and the party in the country. Both have been paralyzed for generations by the fear that socialist policies would lead to lasting exclusion from government, and that only centrism could ensure a Labour Party in office. Tony Blair was the dismal inheritor and exemplar of that fear, and thanks to him, the gap between the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and Labour voters has only continued to grow. Finally, the centrists and the mealy-mouthed liberal media have been shamed by the voters. Of course, the solidarity here at issue is one that I would rather associate with the dynamism of the Bernie Sanders supporters in the United States than with the Trump voters' protests against the elites, the media, and against Washington. The vexing similarities, however, are inescapable. The Brexit vote owed a great deal not merely to racism and xenophobia, prevalent enough in Britain as elsewhere, but to the loathing felt all across Britain for London and its smug, self-satisfied elites, including the media. And as I sought to find phrases in which to present to you briefly the recent British general election, I must be honest, reaching for the terms working class solidarity and labour movement, hanging for so long in my closet and rarely worn, gave off a suspiciously musty smell. Wasn't this smell an indictment of how far I had fallen into a neoliberal globalist worldview? Probably so, I told myself. Yet it may be time, in considering the British political scene, to face the fact that the old voting blocs, whether we're speaking of the trades unions or of the working class as such, aren't quite so easily recognizable in the crowds that turned up to applaud Jeremy Corbyn's campaign. Many of them were so young, almost too young, to belong to any bloc other than the young. There are the poor, ever more with us in a Britain where food banks, once unimaginable, are a feature of the British scene, 2,000 of them across the UK, feeding in the region of 1 million people. Little wonder that what united the Labour voters was both Corbyn's voice of hope and their hatred of the Tories. But what are the jobs of the future now that our pits have closed and our factories are closing? Where is our, British, I could be saying this in America, manufacturing industry? What is it that we make? These are the questions the centrists want us to ask, and rightly so, but they don't want. What's needed, a complete rethink, and among the questions they don't want us to ask are questions about inequality, about health, about the cost of education and the travails of age, above all, about the distribution of wealth. And the evasion of these issues that links a Trump to a Blair and enmeshes a Clinton too, this evasion so often blanketed under a long exposed lie about trickle-down economics, these are the questions unmistakably tabled by the British electorate. We are the forgotten, we are at your gate, and you will not forget us now. Let us hope. As proud as I am to be asked to give the opening address, especially on a topic as urgent as ours is, I wish I were a budding Nobel Prize winner along the lines that Susan mentioned, but I don't think so. I wish I were a hero of some episode of manifest solidarity, whether brief or continuous, and could lay it before you as an inspiration, or at worst, as a tragic tale of solidarity lost but well worth having been attempted. The form of solidarity I would like to present to you for your consideration is a wrestle with internal forces, and I'll explain what I mean. But first, I should say that as an adoptive American, I teach, as Susan mentioned, at the University of New York. I'm acutely aware of the need to set aside internal debates and grasp the nettle of action. It is increasingly being said in America and elsewhere that we owe to Donald Trump's outrageous attempt to steal democracy and sell it to the highest bidder, or perhaps to the lowest bidder, a sense of urgency and consequently of solidarity not seen for generations. We could actually spend a lot of time praising Trump in the name of solidarity, but I don't really want to do so. But this sense of urgency is good news indeed. Solidarity is never more solid than when it is solidarity against. And being a contrarian by nature, this always returns me to a question that has vexed me all my life. Are we humans, by nature, inclined to solidarity? Animal behaviorists have shown us that to the extent that we resemble other creatures, we are, by nature, altruistic. And is altruism, solidarity, writ small? This is the question. When there is no invading army or force threatening our society from within, when there is no drought or disaster to rally us around a cause or around our neighbors, who until the disaster arrived were not actually our dearest friends, what, in a state of relative contentment, is our natural condition with regard to solidarity? Now, clearly, I recognize this as an academic consideration, an anthropological issue rather than a political one. Politics is the practice of social cohesion, whether in a revolutionary or reactionary form. At all times, even in a time of contentment, if there is indeed such a thing, a time of plenty, let us say, there have always been continuing issues of cohesion, of justice, of those who are excluded. Nonetheless, the anthropological perspective, the philosophical perspective, asserts itself to a measurable degree. The more widespread the comforts supplied by a given society, the less manifest the solidarity. I'm afraid the clearest recurring example of this is the history of revolution. Glorious the solidarity of the revolutionaries until they achieve power. And then we can turn to Stalin and to Trotsky, to Danton and to Robespierre, and to their respective followers and say, so, what happened to your solidarity? You won. Now, if ever is the time for solidarity to show its mettle, no longer its teeth gritted in determination, but its generosity. Perhaps the problem is that history remains a history of leaders, of those who, like a Coriolanus or a Churchill, are heroes of war, less fit for peace. Now, I don't wish these to be cynical or reactionary observations. If any degree of enlightened change can be achieved through solidarity, even a temporary solidarity, and even if solidarity is itself a temporary phenomenon, the familiar falling out of leaders formerly welded together by battle should not be used to discourage the fight. The fight must go on. But solidarity as an idea, and again, I'm speaking, you must, I hope you will be patient with my eccentricities as a novelist. Solidarity as an idea seems to me to be a more powerful weapon than it is a tool of peace. And really, how should it be otherwise? We are still the relatively recent descendants of creatures who fought tooth and nail for their existence over, well, at least hundreds of thousands of years. I hope you will forgive me for saying so, but it might be argued that we remain better equipped for conflict psychologically than we are for peace. If so, let this be a fading tradition to be converted to civilized disagreements. For now, you will always find me, I hope, at the heart of the fight. As a young man, I longed to join some Chilean international brigade to intervene in the all too speedy overthrow of Allende. Instead, I wound up touring Britain with Chilean poets as their primary reader aloud of their superb, rousing poetry. My association with the British Communist Party, a dear and useless organization, forgive me for saying this, and if you challenge me on this description, I will tell some stories to make you laugh, which I always say I joined as morally I did, although in truth I was never much more than a busy fellow traveler, endeared me to the Chileans and did something, for me, a good deal more substantial. It brought me to the attention of the African National Congress, for whom I engaged in undercover work in South Africa during the period of Mandela's continued incarceration on Robben Island. We ran risks, some of us were killed. I was enduringly grateful to have been able to be of service to an unimpeachable cause. Subsequent events do not change the urgency of our fight, but the situation in South Africa following the bright dawn of the post-apartheid era returns us to the issue of brief-lived solidarity. We are once more gazing helplessly at a revolution that, little by little, betrays its founding ideals and eats its children. Once again, here is solidarity revealing its human limits, the glory of the cause that, while the struggle rages, conceals the divisions and the temptations available to a victorious revolution. But we will never cease from thanking human reason, steadfastness, and courage for the solidarity that uprooted apartheid. It remains a banner under which to rally and to continue to hope. Now, I told you that I had no heroic tale of personal involvement in solidarity, and this is still the case. For each of us, the London recruits to the African National Congress, as we were and are known, as undercover combatants, we only knew one other, the man who ran our two-person cell. I barely knew the names of my comrades in arms until quite recently, when a book was written about us and a film being made at long last. For each of us as lonely freedom fighters, or terrorists, as the South African government called us, our solidarity was with the cause and not with others. Having also repeated that I'm a contrarian, and since I see the world almost exclusively as a novelist, I should add that I am available to tell the painfully funny stories of human incompetence exhibited by revolutionaries in action. The same incompetence, no more, no less, that we all exhibit in everyday life. It's just, this is awful to say, it's just funnier when the lives of many are at stake. I know that's a dreadful thing to say, but that's how humor is. It honors no cause. I do, though. And although I have written a kind of memoir circulated in the tiny world of ex-revolutionaries, and risking being reviled no less by my ex-wife, who was my comrade in arms, than by others, I would never turn my experiences into a novel, no matter how rich the narrative potential, comic or otherwise. To me, a novel is very serious comedy. I don't mind laughing after dinner at human foibles in revolutionary guise, but I would not expend a single sentence in earnest to trivialize a great and worthy cause. And there you have the issue one more time. On the one hand, the cause and the solidarity it elicited and required, up against human nature at ease, relatively, and being at ease making light of it all. The solidarity of laughers, one might almost say of laughter itself, is by its nature a reactionary solidarity. Few and far between are revolutionary jokes. Solidarity isn't funny. Please prove me wrong. What's funny is always and only our failure to live up to its ideals. This is hardly a painful problem. We can fight and laugh, more or less at once. For me, the difficulty only arises when the fight demands unbroken piety. Despite the organizations I worked alongside, I've always shrunk from churches and professional bodies of all kind, and even though I am the Bishop of Woodstock, as Susan pointed out, I have had comrades, I have been a comrade, but if you address me as comrade, you will see me flinch. It's a description I proudly accept. It's not a title I feel easy with. Comrade is too easily spoken for my liking. I always think of citoyen Sade, Citizen Sade, as the Marquis was during the terror, even as it turned on him. I'm always moved to be called brother. It's a risk to call somebody brother, unless the bond is truly there. I feel you will not call me brother, unless you mean it. Sister, alas, has acquired both a divisive politics and, like comrade, a shop-worn inclusiveness. Comradeship is the essence of solidarity, and it's an incomplete status, one to which I aspire, but one which asks of me how ready I am to claim it. It's when I contemplate this crux that I come to my own insufficiency in solidarity, not so much a failure to show up and work and fight, but an unreadiness of soul. As those of you who very kindly gave my abstract a glance, this brings me to the heart of what I have to ask you, and I will ask it anyway. My question is really, how broad and how deep is our solidarity? Can we include in it, in our hearts, the tormentors, no less than the tormented? Should we even be trying to do so? I certainly don't ask this as a Christian, although I confess that I am a Sephardic Jew raised as a Christian. I'm trying to ask this of myself simply as a human being. If solidarity hides under its cloak the soul of vengeance all too understandably, or uses vengeance as motivation and as nourishment, no less secretly, isn't this where the crumbling of solidarity is hatched when it achieves success? The image of Che Guevara executing prisoners in Cuba after the triumph of the revolution rises up before me. Who could deny him the rage driving this? A rage that has now exceeded its target, but who would wish solidarity to come to this? I like to think that some of you have preferred not to muddy your mind with what a speaker writes as an abstract, or have simply not seen it, which is fine, but to see what really comes out of his or her mouth. So forgive me those of you who, out of respect for our conference, have read my abstract. It's sufficiently unusual, I think, and a departure from everything I've said so far, that I would prefer not to take your familiarity with it for granted. Let me paraphrase it and amplify it as I go. I wrote that I never felt the thrill and the challenge of solidarity more than the day I set out with my son to walk to Auschwitz. This is so, but we were alone. Our comrades were ghostly. Our walk was real. My son is an explorer. He is very tall and very strong, and since our walk took us into the Tatras, the largest range of the Carpathian Mountains, in winter, I was glad that he was so tall and so strong, not so much in fear of the werewolves, vampires, and other mythical inhabitants of the Carpathians, as because if I fell into a snowdrift, he would be just the chap to pull me out. It all came about because the year before I had driven from southern Europe via Hungary to Auschwitz with my family in Budapest. We visited the synagogue where, under Adolf Eichmann's relentlessly efficient guidance, Jews were assembled for departure to their death. You can sit where he sat in the gallery. It's a view not easily forgotten, looking down on what were once row upon row of the soon-to-be murdered. We drove on to Auschwitz. Many of my family died in the camps, all but one deported. Evacuated was the Gestapo's word, evacuiert, from Berlin. One of my great-aunts lived elsewhere in Landshut, and she greeted the Gestapo by jumping to her death from her bedroom window. Perhaps you will forgive me if I mention what to me is a startling statistic. 7,000 Berlin Jews took their life rather than be evacuated. History has many, many other such shocking instances of solidarity to show, similar ones. I choose to regard this one not only as a refusal to surrender choice of death, but as a refusal to leave Berlin. Our visit to Auschwitz was to me a dreadful one in more than the ways that were to be expected. And I've been back a number of times since. I've been to other camps where members of my family were confined, not always fatally, but I had never experienced so keenly a sense of being a tourist, a kind of horror tourist, certainly the wrong sort of solidarity, as at Auschwitz, where bidders for our coin besieged our car, begging us to choose their car park. In many ways I don't need to go into, I was left with a need to cleanse myself somehow of what a visit to Auschwitz had come to represent, even to atone for the manner of my participation. I've been to Auschwitz by bus and absurdly perhaps felt less compromised. It hardly matters how valid my feelings were. They were intense enough to make me want to reapply myself to the journey I had made. The idea of a pilgrimage on foot brought some relief. For me, at least, say that I found my visit to Auschwitz insufficient, as everyone must. I felt assaulted and infected by the incommensurability of grief. When I mentioned my plan to my son, he immediately volunteered to join me. It was the drive from Budapest to Auschwitz that focused my thoughts. The journey from the Budapest synagogue to Auschwitz. None of our forebears had lived in Budapest, but my encounter with the relics of Hungarian fascism in support of Nazi genocide had seared me. On closer inspection, I found that the greatest number of Jews had been dispatched to their death from Budapest in the shortest space of time during the summer of 1944. I felt as if this had burned a groove into the map of Europe, among its many grooves of shame. The internet proved a remarkable ally. I was able to find the railway lines that led out of Poland, past tiny hamlets across Slovakia, past more hamlets into Poland, and to Auschwitz. Many of these hamlets had small inns and taverns which offered phone numbers. I spoke none of the languages involved, but was able somehow to communicate the arrival of two strangers in the middle of winter on a given date, and on that date they were invariably expecting us. We walked in January because my son was free and my universities closed in January against bad weather, and also because January 2005, which was the year we walked, contained the 60th anniversary of the death march out of Auschwitz on the 18th of January 1945, westward bound on foot as the Russians approached. A few, including Primo Levi, had been left behind to the tender mercies, and mercifully they were largely tender, of the avenging army. Of those on the death march, it is said that the vast majority died. Strangely, this terrible march had already made itself a part of my life and engendered, I suppose, a kind of solidarity, because entirely by chance I had met three of its survivors, two of them a big woman and a small one. The big woman had carried the small one all the way. This seemed to me to call to commemorate them. Thanks to the internet, I've been able to find roads that ran beside the old railway lines, in many cases right beside the lines, for long stretches. Sometimes antique cattle trucks rolled by, old enough to have been part of the human evacuation of Budapest, close enough to touch, too late. The 240-mile walk took us 2 weeks and allowed me to feel some degree of expiation, of exorcism of the ease of access that I had felt unavoidably colluding with the commercialization of the camps, and which had stained my previous visit. This was, after all, the headquarters of human shame, and I had felt as if it had become part of a package tour. I readily admit that my pilgrimage was a romantic alternative, but still, whatever works for you. Of course, we walked in parkas and walking boots, mindful every day of the poor clothing and wooden sabot with which the death marchers had been equipped. We were fit, fairly fit in my case. I had trained for months, but my feet were still barely up to it. Well-fed, slept in comfortable beds. We walked through a landscape of shuttered houses, villages the European Union had not yet refurbished, bleak localities, sad, as if under a curse, as well they might be, peopled by barking dogs who handed us on from one hamlet to the next. My son, Sam, the doughty explorer, for whom our trek appeared to be a walk in the park, is named for his great-great-grandfather. As I've mentioned, many of our family, Jews who came to Berlin from Poland, and before that from Turkey, and before that from Spain, died in the Shoah. Here I wrote in my abstract, I must break open the can of beans I bring with me to this gathering. We had ghostly companions, of course. We walked in solidarity with the murdered, those of our own family and so many others. But in solidarity also, and in my abstract I said, I welcome a challenge to my choice of words, with the SS, the murderers. People to whom I've spoken before and after our walk have been upset, disgusted even when I speak of this. I'm driven to speak of it. I'm driven not to omit it from a story that otherwise seems incorrectly to categorize me as some kind of worthy pilgrim. As the adjective, to me it's a vile neologism, goes today, my story makes me so relatable. Now, relatable should mean easy to relate, not easy to relate to, but prepositions, and I speak as a teacher of English composition, are the first pieces to fail in the machinery of syntax. So no, I dare not suppress the difficult stuff. Only a week ago, when I felt obliged not to omit it in the presence of two Berliners I greatly admire and to whom I owe much, non-Jewish researchers of the Holocaust, their faces closed aghast like steel doors, as well they might. So here's what I wrote concluding my abstract. The barbarians are inside us, no less than the victims. Unless we understand that we too, as human beings, have a murderer within, we have no right to claim solidarity with anyone. First and foremost, our solidarity needs to be with human nature, with humanity, if you will, but humanity in all its guises. Then and only then may we choose sides. For me, that was the challenge of our walk. our meditation, to find in ourselves not only the persecuted, but the persecutors. This is not a project that affords success, only failure. Over and over as I walk around Berlin, recognizing lieux de mémoire in streets after streets, places where people assembled for their last journey, places where people were arrested, dragged into the street, in some cases shot trying to escape, places where the blind were brought out to be evacuated, where children were brought out. Last week I was in a building from which 50 orphans were led out to be murdered. As I walk that haunted Berlin, I fail to live up to the horror. I fail even more grievously to be those who administered it. I don't concentrate my effort on imagining what it's like to be a sadist. There aren't enough sadists in the world to guarantee the triumph of evil. What does so is it's a little more than good people failing to act. It's people assisting evil deeds because they're afraid to step out of line, afraid to become conspicuous in their refusal. Now, it's often been maintained by legitimate historians that it was possible to refuse to take a job in the death camps. By and large, your choice was tolerated. You were not sent to the Russian front. On the other hand, you might take the job in the camps on the grounds that you could be sent to the Russian front at some point anyway, without actually having committed a crime. And in the camps, you'd be more likely to survive. Then you found you had to avert your soul from what you were doing. In the most cases, I believe that's a true description. This is the piece of the rock climb where my imagination is most engaged. You are doing what the Führer decreed, no matter what you felt about it, no matter how horrible it was. I'm quoting, "Do you really think we enjoyed this?" was said by some of those who administered the camps. Do you really think we enjoyed this? It's the sentence that I can never get away from. Is it a lie? Is it true? It's so absurd. It's so appalling. How to think about those words? And some probably did enjoy the absolute hideous power. Others persuaded themselves that these creatures who looked so like people were in fact vermin in human form and had to be eliminated. I mean, as I say that, I think of the countless movies, particularly movies, because this is a thought that appeals to the movie maker much more than, let's say, to the novelist, where people who look like people are in their pod people. They've already been taken over, but you can't tell from looking at them. And our readiness at the movies to subscribe to that idea, which of course is a metaphor for our own alienation from other people, many of whom we believe are pod people when we look at our neighbors and our friends, that image and our ready collusion in it as a metaphor, in a way, is a help, if help is the awful word that I could really need to use, in understanding how it was possible for people to think not only of Jews as barely human, not only in the case of the Holocaust, in all cases applying in human history, to allow yourself to commit the unspeakable by denying to yourself the humanity of your victims. And so, if you were in the camps as a persecutor, an administrator, as a murderer, as a complicit person, once you were there, it might be smarter not to bail. This is the step-by-step story of evil, not so very different from everyday life. A matter of blurring boundaries so that you never notice when you cross into the unforgivable. It's imaginable, I think. A primrose path to damnation, worth tracing in imagination. Better, we might say, not to make a project of this catalogue of shame. Let memorials in which Berlin is admirably, even astoundingly rich, do the job. Pay frequent respects. Live also in the new Berlin. As far as I'm concerned, that is the new Berlin. Experience, well, I'm projecting it onto Kreuzberg with no...
But it's it, yeah.
It fits. It's perfect. I've seen scenes like that very happily in Kreuzberg and Neukölln with great pride in humanity, which I really think, departing from my script, it's possible to feel in Berlin. Extraordinary pride in being human, not something that is easily found anywhere on the globe. So that has to be put on the credit side. Berlin uniquely, when you look at human history, when you look geographically at nation by nation, at empire by empire, at the complete failure to acknowledge the horrors committed under a previous regime in a previous world and a previous empire, Germany stands out and Berlin stands out as the jewel of that attempt. It can never be anything more than an attempt to acknowledge. And that is so magnificently human that it's extraordinarily animating and inspiring to feel it in Berlin, as I often can. So experience solidarity, I was going to say, with this fine multicultural city, imperfect, as all cities are, but in many respects exemplary. And I do experience that solidarity. But I'm concerned too about how we guard against the return of barbarism anywhere in the world. This is what keeps me focused on solidarity with evil. Reject me for this phrase by all means. I don't, of course, mean sympathy for the devil. I mean acknowledging kinship with a thing I'm ready to die rather than yield to. I simply don't believe, nor will anyone ever persuade me, that evil is a thing that comes from elsewhere, supernatural, or growing like a terrible virus from some satanic seed. To me, that attitude is like a portal open to hell. It makes the next wave of barbarity possible by declaring it a foreigner, alien, unrecognizable, not us, not in us. I say it is in us, and in experiencing a terrible kinship with it, by taking a little arsenic with our tea and noticing that we tolerate it surprisingly well, we will better recognize what it is that we need to isolate and attack, because it is in the mirror that we will discover its recurrence. Thank you for your patience with me. Yes, absolutely.
Wow. I think I'm going to confine my remarks to that. But if no one has an immediate thought, I want to try, while you're gathering your thoughts, to just push back a little bit. I loved the things that you said at the end about, making evil possible by declaring it alien. I take this to be the most important message of Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which has been misread in so many ways. But Arendt also argued very much against the interpretation, there's a little Eichmann in all of us. Right. And I'm just wondering if we can find a point between evil is what those guys do, and particularly SS, and, evil is in all of us. There's a certain kind of humility that I find not just attractive, but morally crucial. I will take this all the way back to Kant, who claims that we have so little knowledge of ourselves, real self-knowledge, that we do not know if anyone has ever, in the history of the world, done something that was genuinely moral.
Right.
On the other hand, when I look at some of the people I know, or Paul Robeson, who we both admire, I find it awfully hard not to say, well, no, she really does something moral, and he really does something moral, and, and not that I can't imagine her or him doing something evil, but I worry about trying to express the relationship between otherness and evil. I mean, for Arendt, it was, no, you make a decision.
Yes.
You make a decision, and actually Jan Philip Reemsma, who's the chairman of our board of trustees, I don't think it's too much to say that his parents were Nazis, and he has spent his life coming to terms with that, trying to figure out what would be a just and moral way of dealing with that inheritance. And there's a point in probably his magnum opus, Trust and Violence, in which he says, I am not someone who belongs to the murderers. That's an attitude that you can just simply say. So those are just some thoughts. I wonder if you want to...
I hear everything you say, and I agree completely. I would just make one point that I don't think a decision is made. I think an enormous number of tiny decisions are made,
yes.
none of which look like embracing enormity. And when you find you tiptoe, as I imagine it, I have to say, because I find it, I'm so appallingly safeguarded in my soul against sadism that I suspect myself of being a secret sadist in a good Freudian spirit of the dialectics of the soul. You know, if I'm really that hostile to this evil thing, am I really attracted to this evil thing? I mean, it's appropriate dialectical thinking, but I am so incapable of seeing, thinking about sadistic actions and so on and so forth, that it seems to me unimaginable. Yet, when I ask myself, how do I get to be Eichmann? Who gets to be Eichmann? Do people start very early with sociopathic tendencies? Yes. Are those made more acute by all sorts of living circumstances? Certainly. Are some people maybe exceptionally sociopathic in their DNA? Probably. But I fear there will always be Eichmanns. I fear there will always, how can there not be people whose character or whose lives have led them to a hunger, a need, an appetite, an absolute addiction to vengeance. Now, with them, I struggle to identify them in myself, and I don't really think we should. But I think that it's the people who fail to stop it, who find themselves being a part of it, who little by little can no longer extricate themselves, and who are machine gunning people who they know to be innocents, and have reached this point. Somebody says shoot them, and it's your life or theirs. You don't shoot them, you're dead. You do shoot them, you move on to the next square on the board. And I'm so grateful that life has never put me at that knife point. I hope I would simply have the courage to say, no, shoot me. But when I think of it and I think, maybe I wouldn't, maybe I would find some reason in myself to shoot this person and think, I will make up for it later in life, in my next life, at some other time. I will compensate for the terrible thing that I'm doing. I think there are all these little steps that fascinate me because they seem to me to add up to catastrophe. And so I'm very nervous of categories which separate them from us. And really what I'm trying to explain to myself, to you, is the fact that I found myself on this walk feeling that it was shockingly easy to identify with the victims, many of whom, in my case, my close family, but I could identify with all of them, because what am I going to do? I identify also with those fearless people who actually, even in the camps, rebelled against it, fought and lost their lives, or threw themselves against an electrified fence, refused to cooperate in their own murder. Those are people I love and wish to be a part of. I feel a solidarity with people who did that, and I like to think that I would do it. I would not let myself be led like sheep. I would not. I feel that's a heroic version of myself. But I'm there on the walk, And I'm thinking, it's all too easy to identify with the victim. So what am I doing, putting one foot after the other? My meditation must be, suppose I'm a guard and not a victim. And I thought, that's challenging. I need to be challenging myself. The point of this walk is to challenge myself, not just to do it. So hence all these rationalizations.
Dominic Bonfiglio is first.
I just have a small comment on that. Is this working?
Is that on? Yeah. Can you hear in the back?
Yeah, I just have a small comment on that score. About the Eichmann within. I think it very much depends on who's saying it. If Eichmann is saying it, or his like, then it sounds like justification, right? If everyone's like Eichmann, then maybe Eichmann isn't really that bad after all. If the people who aren't Eichmann are saying, I have a little Eichmann within, maybe that's their way of preparing themselves for the moment, should they ever have to make a decision. Now, of course, most people don't have to make that decision, so they never really know. So I think that the good side of thinking about the potential for evil is to remind yourself that this uncertainty, you do not know until you actually make that decision. And then once you do make a decision, then there's a huge difference between the people who have Eichmann within and decided one way and the people who have Eichmann within and decided another way. Then there is, I think, at that point, a world apart. And it's hard then to reconcile those two.
But Dominic, I don't know if we can speak of having or not having an Eichmann within. I can't imagine it that way. That means that it's almost physicalizing it, like there's a little thing, creature in there that is there or isn't there. Whereas I think we're much more molten. We don't know who or what we are until we are at the point of a knife or at the point of a gun. And I mean, this, I'm sorry, forgive me, is utterly vainglorious, but I didn't know who I was until in South Africa, I was at the point of a gun. Other times in my life, I've been at the point of a gun, and to my amazement, I didn't crumble. I think it's perfectly normal to crumble. I assumed I was an abject coward and that this was absolutely normal and that everybody should be. But then when I found I wasn't, and I was a coward, but I wasn't abject. I was afraid, but somehow I got through it. It gave me an extraordinary sensation of my human substance, that there was, and I guess I'm almost succumbing to the Eichmann within theory, because I'm saying there was someone within who was not. There was someone within who resisted. And I always say, although it sounds absurd, that was the day that confirmed my sense of myself as a writer. This is partly because, as a writer, I'm always accusing myself of being an observer and not an actor. That agency is missing, and do I know what I... This is why writers get into the ring, like Mailer and Hemingway, in order to locate that part of themselves that cannot be indicted for failure. But this is all faux masculinity and absolute nonsense. But we tend to be vulnerable to it. And at that moment, I thought, oh, okay, there's someone in here. Because otherwise, until then, how does one know? I'm all in favor of people who crumble because I think that's normal. I was just very grateful that I didn't. And I thought, oh, thank God. I can approach the business of writing with a measure of self-respect. And for me, that was extraordinary. But I just don't think you know who and what you are. I always, and perhaps this is somewhat another slightly embarrassing confession, I tend to say to the would-be writers who I teach, I say, please go out. I mean, I say go out. First thing you do is get out of this classroom. We can learn nothing about writing in a classroom. Live, have your heart broken more than once, and if possible, put yourself in a perilous situation. Peril can come in many forms, where you discover something about yourself, because this will... It's important as a writer to have an index of who and what you are. I'm sorry, Dominic, it's such a good question now. I've gone totally off the topic.
Rady Daston behind you. It's okay.
Thank you, Carey. That was a great-hearted meditation. But I wonder, my question is, do you think compassion is necessary for solidarity? You delivered your meditation as if it were, but the reason why I balk at it is thinking of the ways in which the plight of those who need our solidarity now is presented.
Right.
It is presented in ways deliberately to manipulate a certain form of selective empathy. The harping upon the number of children affected is only the worst symptom of this.
Absolutely.
And I wonder whether or not we couldn't move to a less emotion-laden view of solidarity, which had to do with the dignity of human beings, with the possibility that fortune might strike us at some moment in the same way, something beyond compassion.
Oh, I couldn't agree with Rennie, thank you so much. I couldn't agree with you more. And when I spoke of being in a place where children have been dragged out, it was a strange moment in Nazi history where many of the early evacuees to their death, their children were left behind and they went to refuges. And as these numbers of these children built up, it came to a point in 42 where the Nazis thought, we can't just have all these children lying around. So they decided to send them all to Auschwitz. So when I was facing this, I have to say that the work to do for me was almost entirely to do with imagining the children. There was very little room left over to imagine the people who dragged them out of that house. I'm just conscious of, with the tiny proportion of compassion that might be left for the persecutors, I want to make sure that it is as human beings that I see them, because their failure was to see the children as human beings. They could not see them as human beings. If I failed to see them as human beings, we're both partaking in the same process.
Philip Kitcher was next.
Well, first, thank you very much. That was wonderfully eloquent and very moving. And I want to just to invite you to say more about the phenomenology of this ghosts along the way as you were walking along. I'm going to make an assumption, which you can say is false at the very beginning, that when the ghosts were present together, if they were ever present together, then the solidarity and relations of solidarity were profoundly different from when you were, as it were, thinking about the guards on the one hand, or about the victims on the other. And I want to ask you to reflect on whether, as you walked along and thought at times about the victims and at times about the guards, about whether the relations of solidarity were importantly different in those two cases.
They were.
And perhaps that can give us the beginning of a way of thinking about how to map what this extremely complex and I think rather difficult notion of solidarity might be.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so helpful for me to unpack what I feel is going on. You're exactly right. When I thought about the victims, I thought of them as a group, and I thought about the problems that I feel my own family had abandoned the religion. So I thought very much about the consolations of religion for those who had it, and giving a particular form of solidarity which was not available to those who, like my family, had stepped away from the religion. So I was thinking entirely in groups, and when I think about the guards, it's just the one of them. It's a one-on-one relationship of me to them, asking myself, is there any way that I can preserve for myself their humanity so that I don't dehumanize them as they dehumanize their victims? So, but it was always one-on-one. You're absolutely right. So the phenomenology of this is very interesting. I never spent any time, although, I mean, as it were, I could have, imagining the guards as a group. It's quite interesting. Their quarters were a long way from the gas chambers. As well they might have been made, but really a very long way. I mean, miles away in the vast precinct that is Auschwitz, Birkenau. And so But then I'm terrified of imagining them, because then I'm imagining them with the worst stereotypes in the world. They're listening to music, they're listening to the kitschy German folk songs they all loved, they're writing happy postcards home, and I realize I've fallen down a terrible rabbit hole in which I'm failing to imagine them as singular individuals. They have become types. But thank you so much for making me think about that. I'm so grateful to you, because what you say is exactly right.
Pat Kitcher, I believe. And then Glenn.
I have a worry about the little by little.
Right.
Because to me, part of keeping the humanity of everybody is that these people are not crazy.
Right.
Let's separate crazies where they are not responsible.
Exactly.
These people, little by little, whether it's fast or slow, at each stage, they knew they were killing humans.
Yes.
I don't accept they didn't know those children were human. They didn't know the adults were human.
Right.
They knew they were all human.
Right.
And so I take your point that with the Eichmann within, you don't want to have this little thing in, and you don't want to have a sort of entity view of this. But I also think it's quite important in keeping everybody's humanity that they always knew
Yes.
what they were doing was wrong. And that seems to me something that, as one's thinking about this, I do not share your pessimism that this is inevitable. I think that it's what happens is people have bad things happen. I mean, you've got some crazies, fine.
Right.
There's some crazies, but those are very rare. And then you have horrible things happen and difficulties. And so I worry that there's a pessimism here and a not treating at each stage. At every stage,
yes.
They had that choice because they were human.
Oh, I agree entirely. I don't acquit them of one.
You wanted someone to push back.
No, but I'm so glad you say that. But I don't acquit them of any of the steps, even the tiniest steps towards atrocious things, not to be acquitted for any of it. So there I agree with you so much. The attempt to imagine it is not an attempt to acquit it at all. You are taking on, you are trying to see how you can continue to imagine their behavior as human when the temptation is to relegate it to some subhuman region. But the pessimistic thing is so important. The only pessimism I can find in myself is a sense that we are still awfully near to the atavistic struggles that brought us here. I mean, here we are all reasonable people and wearing the expressions of reasonable people and the clothes of reasonable people. But it's so recently that we were clawing our way to existence, and we're doing so awfully fast, and we hope so much that we can achieve reasonable and intelligent and peaceful society, and it's so difficult because we have so much to overcome.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't agree with that, but I'll let it be. I mean,
Glenn
it's a scientific question.
But thank you. It's a very important point.
Thank you very much. I'd like to get back to the question of solidarity with the victimizers, because it seems to me a rather different case from solidarity with the victims, and to be more perplexing and paradoxical even than you were suggesting.
Right.
Because the perpetrators, the victimizers, with whom you are feeling some degree of solidarity, are themselves people who did not feel solidarity.
Yes.
And that means that there's a limit to the degree of identification possible for the relation of solidarity with these people, because the more you feel solidarity with them, the more you recognize that there's a fundamental difference, that they felt no solidarity whatsoever. So that instead of solidarity bringing you to a sense of similarity, it brings you also to a sense of difference.
That's so right. Yeah. That's so right. Thank you. I hate to interrupt you, but I just want to agree completely. I mean, I'm uncomfortable at the idea that I am experiencing solidarity with the victimizers. This is the project I say is doomed to fail. In a different way, the project of truly identifying with the sufferings of the victims is also doomed to fail, because it's too enormous to enter into and still be standing. But the project to identify with the victimizers is a hopeless project in which I do not expect to succeed or want to succeed. I only want to get across the threshold of refusing to imagine in principle their humanity. Once I'm beyond that threshold, I'm in very strange territory where I cannot dwell for exactly the reasons that you cited.
May I add another question of a different sort? You're a novelist, and novelists can elicit our sympathy for sympathetic characters. That's not very interesting.
Right.
What is interesting is to try to elicit a degree of sympathy for profoundly repulsive or repugnant or unsympathetic characters.
Exactly.
He does that too. I'm reading a very long novel.
And this is the case not only with novels, but literature as a whole. That is a much more interesting exercise in our moral sensitivities than in making us feel sympathetic for people who are sympathetic to begin with.
Yeah, that's so right.
So how is this different for you, this experience of your real life, from your writing a novel?
It's a wonderful question, thank you. In a very different way, in a way that in some ways is perverse in its very nature. I feel drawn as a novelist to characters who are almost impossible to sympathize with by their very nature, and try and find a way to surprise. I mean, empathy, and just that one word, is the novelist's creed and practice. It's all about empathy, and if you reach a place where you can refuse empathy to groups of people, you're in trouble as a novelist. And I, as Susan knows all too well, have felt the call to try to address Adolf Hitler. Never mind Eichmann, never mind camp guards, and to create a character, a psychoanalyst, who, because she is not Jewish, is called on in desperation by Hitler to try and heal his niece, who he adores and is obsessed with, and prevent her from taking her life, which the psychoanalyst fails to do. And then Hitler turns up in her waiting room on the anniversary of his niece's suicide, and gradually, year after year, he comes a little closer, and then he's in her waiting room, and he never becomes her patient, but she believes that she has become his confidant, and she nourishes in her heart an idea of who Hitler is that I suspect has never been offered to the public before, because who would want to do this? She
The writer's equivalent of, climbing Mount Everest.
it might easily be. She suffers from the therapist's disease, a very appropriate disease of absolutely identifying with her client, her patient, as the victim of circumstances, without which you cannot get patients, because they won't come back to you. If you say to a patient, "It's your fault, not your mother's," they won't come back. So it's of the essence of the therapist's art and science is this process of identification. So I have a conduit. I have somebody who can imagine. I mean, I have a very unlikely enabler in this whole process, which is Goering, who said that Hitler was never the same after the suicide of his niece. Now that's in some ways my starting point. In what way was he never the same again? What does this mean? So my psychoanalyst, in creating for herself a Hitler who she believes she might save, creates a man who is actually a healer, a natural-born healer, whom circumstances have turned into its obverse, and who replaces his dead niece with the Reich. And that her job is to try and get him back to nature, which Hitler loved, and the love of which he propagated in a long German tradition. She sees him as a German romantic, an heir that to the tradition of German Romanticism. Now, whether I can present this plausibly to the public is another question. But it is exactly, as you were saying, unless the novelist attempts to astonish our instincts, it's what you said. If you're trying to make sympathetic people sympathetic, there's no project. So I feel this deeply in my soul, and I thank you for saying it.
Eva Iluz.
Thank you. I have maybe what will look like a petty question of conceptual clarification. Since we're speaking about solidarity, I'm a sociologist, and in sociology, solidarity has a very specific meaning. It's the kind of energy, the kind of field of energy you get sucked into by a group or a crowd. Freud described it very well in his famous essay on ego psychology and the and the crowd. I don't remember exactly the title, and the psychology of the crowd. And it's a very, in Freud, but also in Durkheim in a way, it is a very regressive type of experience. And it is the kind of experience that you imagine very well the members of the 101 police battalion that Christopher Browning described as having had the choice whether to continue shooting or not continue shooting, kept shooting. And he says they kept shooting in order to remain in a way solidary with their friends who were shooting. So, but you were speaking, it seems to me, at times of identification with somebody who is far away. Glenn referred to it even in novelistic term. That seems to me very far from that notion of solidarity. So solidarity is about groups, and it's about that kind of, as I said, regressive energy that you get sucked into. So what are we talking about when we speak about solidarity?
This is such a good question, and I'm a little ashamed to put before you such a radical notion, and a notion, a kind of radical anthropological notion. The sociology of crowds is tremendously important. I'm a football fan. I am exceptionally aware of the regressive nature of life, particularly if I'm in the Olympic Stadium supporting Hertha Berlin. I don't know if you've ever seen that, let alone participated in it. The Ostkurve is one of the famous bodies of fans in all sport. And if you're there and you watch them jumping up and down, you can hardly watch the game for the extraordinary display of the regressive solidarity that you're talking about. And of course, that indeed is solidarity. And I didn't want to venture into the many territories in which the word is important to construe. I was working a much narrower seam, and I'm glad that you mentioned that. It's so important.
I want to say that I think solidarity is always regressive.
And I would want to challenge that, Eva, without getting lost in. Okay, we have several. I'm taking the moderator's privilege, but before calling on other people, I am not a football fan at all. This is a long-standing half joke between myself and our deputy director, Martin Schad. I find, mass sporting events incomprehensible when there's so many good movies in the world to see and so many good, anyway. But I understand that it's a phenomenon in which many, many people whom I respect and even love share. But I want to argue that there's a major difference between the kind of behavior that takes place at a football stadium and what takes place, for example, at reenactment. Something that I just recently experienced myself: reenactment of Bloody Sunday without the blood on the Edward Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, or mutatis mutandis. a group of people who are united for something with content that does not just mean, yay, my team.
Right.
I think the latter is regressive, and if some people enjoy regressing in that way, it's harmless. But I experience a really non-regressive non-regressive feeling when, in the few times in my life that I have been part of a group of people who are united by, as Carey put in his lecture about South Africa, united by a cause.
Yeah.
We could argue about this, but there's several people who want to speak. Jennifer Stolman in the back.
It's hard to go after a comment about football, so I'm going to try. I'm completely compelled by your talk. Thank you very much. It very much resonates with me in the work that I do in the American South. I'm hearing a lot of sort of ideas about choice and individual choice, and I'm wondering if we're being too hard on the individual. I'm very much compelled by your idea of solidarity with, quote, the victimizers as well as the victims, and having empathy differently than sympathy. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the ways in which, when you say everybody makes a series of choices, how other individuals can help interrupt those choices. And so you don't get to solidarity by yourself. You get to solidarity because other people collaborate or in community with you. I suppose I'm mixing the language of different paradigms. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the bridges that get crossed when victimizers stop being victimizers, or when...
Yeah, this is so important and so interesting. Thank you for saying that. But I think that as individuals, often in defiance of their friends and their family, feel drawn to the possibilities offered by fascism, for instance. You don't need to be raised in a fascist household or belong to a fascist group. Fascism calls to you out of a part of your psyche that you may not have known was there, because it fulfills something that you didn't know that you wished to fulfill it in this way, or that you even felt it. And I see it as a tremendously individual act. You then immediately find yourself in your choice. I'm thinking of, actually, right now, of Goebbels flipping a coin to decide whether he would go to a National Socialist meeting or a communist meeting. This was before he was committed to either. He flipped a coin. It came down National Socialism. I'm sorry, I'm introducing that slightly at cross purposes, but I'm seeing for a moment what it means when you've made your initial choice, and then you find a group of people, contrary-wise, you find yourself to be gay, to belong to a sexual preference group that is not easily respected in the family, the society, the town in which you are. You meet up with others, and suddenly you're a gang. You've made a choice that will give you a form of solidarity that hopefully is not purely regressive, although I'm very interested in the idea that all solidarity is regressive, because that seems to me, I totally agree with what Susan says. I'm just very interested in the idea that one should look at it that way and be suspicious of solidarity in all its forms. That, however, seems to me to exalt the individual conscience to an extent that I'm not sure that we're capable of living up to, but it's a wonderful idea. And so I'm wondering, you're thinking of enablers here who might prevent some of these steps. I can only remember, I just think of how I got involved in Communist Party activities. It was because one friend of mine whom I admired joined the party, and I think of my life spent doing things like that. I think of myself on a bus with a friend who said, "I'm so in love with Valerie Fletcher," a girl that we both knew. I promptly looked at Valerie Fletcher differently from the way I'd ever looked at her, and courted her, and by a series of events so strange that you can't possibly want to know, even if you have the entire evening with me, she became my second wife, not my first. However, my ability to follow, to be a follower, is what strikes me in what you say. Nobody could have stopped me. My family thought I was doing it against them, as so many families do when someone makes a choice radically different from the one that they've made. It's not their choice, it's the choice made against them. And I think nobody could have stopped me, and I'm groping to find exemplars of what you're talking about, which is so interesting. You couldn't say one more thing, could you, to get me on the right path?
It's what I do for a living.
To interrupt.
To interrupt the negative choices that people might make to uphold racism in the South.
Oh, I want to hear so much about that. That's so interesting.
Come back tomorrow night at 6:30.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. I can't wait to hear about it.
I saw 3 hands. This gentleman was first. We're running a bit late, but go ahead.
Okay. Yes, I would like to pick up on what you said now with the question of following. First of all, because I understand you that also your search for solidarity is a search for being solidary with your own internal struggle, as you said before.
That's right.
So to have to open up the possibility inside yourself and in others to turn around from this blind, so to speak, following. And but in this respect, I have another point, which maybe is more difficult. But I wanted to ask you about the dimension of healing in all that what you are reporting.
Yes.
I mean, you have been active in South Africa, and there we have this project of the Reconciliation Commission, which, of course, was never possible in Germany or Europe. And I understand your way, your walk, and your meditation, and your conclusion you came to as a kind of, maybe it's difficult to say, but I understand it as a kind of representative. You are choosing to be yourself for a potential healing process.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm going too far, but maybe you can comment on it.
No, I liked it very much. Thank you. The reconciliation process that was enabled in South Africa was a remarkable one and a model for many other reconciliation processes which have been less successful. But then in the end, unfortunately, South Africa has tumbled into the trap of divisiveness. And I've just read an immensely long speech, a Castro-length speech by the secretary of the South African Communist Party indicting the ANC for its many undoubted crimes, and it's a terrible thing to read after a struggle has triumphed. It's frightful. But the matter of healing, I'm very suspicious. And here, I spent so much time with Freud, largely because I was asked by the BBC to write a biographical drama about Freud, which took me 2 years, and then I wrote a novel, and Freud has wormed his way deeply into my heart, and I love him dearly, but he's crazy. So it's with that, it's really with Freud in mind that I think that so often that a healer is a killer who has reversed the polarity in his soul or her soul. And that often you actually see the polarities reverse themselves again, and healers suddenly find that the power that they exert is irresistible to use for things other than healing. It's a terrifying thing. We like to think as novelists that we affect some kind of a healing process, but it's very devious. It's individuals in their soul who decide where they're going to go. But I love that you raised the concept of healing.
Last 2 questions. This lady here, whose name I don't know, you don't have a question anymore. You did.
More than a question, maybe is a consideration, because the topic is very challenging, and of course I feel what you have said about the possibility to, well, not really identify, but at least to understand the persecutor. While you were speaking about Freud, it went into my mind his phrase, quite famous. He used to say, we try to be the owner in our house.
Yes.
In respect to this phrase and to this consideration of psychoanalysis, I think that the difference between the victim and the persecutor is that the persecutor, in my mind, at least thinking of what happened during the Holocaust, never tried to be really the owner in his house. They didn't really wanted to understand themselves like human beings,
right.
So with the same humility of the victim, but rather try to do the opposite, to be Superman.
Yes.
And this is why I think that in a way it is not very easy to identify with the persecutor.
I couldn't agree more, and for precisely those reasons.
Last question, this young woman here.
Hi, thank you. I want to press you on the same issue that it's come up a few times about how to humanize the victimizer. So first, what I would like, I think it would be helpful for me if you maybe identify some concrete features, the moral subjectivity, that if that's illuminated, then that could help understand sort of what we're made of. So, and you mentioned a number of different things, and in particular, I'm interested in what are the particular stressors that you take to be critical when moral judgments goes wrong. So you mentioned the risk of death, uncertainty. So you mentioned a bunch of different things.
Yes.
So I wonder if you could sort of pinpoint a few central things that could then show what the ethical labor of humanizing the perpetrator does for us. Second question is, well, you're flirting with something I think that could be potentially very dangerous. And specifically, what is, again, the ethical labor of imagining the point of view of perpetrators? I mean, I think of sort of criticisms of depictions of horrific violence, especially in film, and what are we doing ethical work there, or are we just allowing for these kinds of images to populate sort of our imagination and make us worse judges of situations? So
Thank you so much. I so like your points. They're so important. Yes, I'm inadequate to the full potential breadth of how you're seeing my enterprise in terms of moral identification. I'm blatantly inadequate to it, nor do I entirely want to fulfill it. I have no interest in going into the execution of violent deeds in order to humanize, because I don't think that does. These are things that I refuse to accept as part of appropriate behavior. It comes back to not acquitting them of doing this. My forms of my attempts to prevent myself from dehumanizing perpetrators is, I'm afraid, limited to something that's come up elsewhere, which is glimpsing almost immediately the need not to make oneself conspicuous by refusing to participate. So you find yourself asked to do things you don't want to do, but that part of you that says, I don't think I want to be doing this, has to be silenced for fear of becoming a victim of your fellows.
So if I could just press a little bit.
Please.
So you're a novelist. So let's paint this story of an SS officer holding a rifle and about to pull the trigger.
Yes.
And we put ourselves in their point of view, in their shoes. If you could just sum up what we're supposed to learn from their moral subjectivity.
Well, thank you for asking. Learn is a difficult word here, because I don't think we can be made to learn anything. As a teacher, as a professor of literature, I can only point to what it is that has animated my understanding, I cannot ask them to learn in the way that if I was teaching mechanical engineering, there are certain things I would expect them to learn so that they don't build bridges that fall down. So learn is a tricky word there for me, but what might we observe, let's put it that way, from a description that I as a novelist might make of that moment? I see it as a completely alienated moment for the perpetrator. I don't see them as entirely present. I see them as anticipating their ability to dismiss it in memory, and that's to say, something we all do in ways in which we don't have to be holding a rifle and firing it. We find ourselves doing something that we know in advance we will prefer not to remember in retrospect. And so we anesthetize a part of ourselves in anticipation, and then we do it, whatever this thing is. Sometimes, you know, it's some action that we're called upon to do in a family situation or in a professional situation that we would rather not do, but we get ourselves through it by, in a sense, removing ourselves from the present instant and transferring ourselves out of it to what is to come the moment after you've fired. When you're back to yourself again, you're no longer the person about to do a terrible thing. So I think it's almost beggars description. I think that I've read many wonderful novels which take the point of view of a criminal. I don't think you can write a novel about a serial murderer that takes you repeatedly to the moment of killing. I don't think you could write a novel about a child abuser that leads you into the moment of child abuse, because there I think, then coming back to this word learn, there are things to be observed that should not be observed, just as film is glutting itself on violence porn. Similarly, literature must beware, I think, of that violence porn transferred into words. There are ways in which you can approach the psychology of somebody who is a criminal and commits continuous criminal acts without taking people inside the moment of violence, partly because I think that's psychologically correct, because I don't think they're entirely there in the moment of violence.
On that note, Carey, that was an absolutely wonderful opening. Thank you. Thank all of you for the discussion. You're all invited at least to discuss a little more over a glass of wine downstairs. But please join me in thanking Carey Harrison.
Thank you.